There are things that happen to you in life that you never talk about. Not because you're ashamed, not because people wouldn't believe you, but because the moment you open your mouth and start explaining, you can already see the look in their eyes, that slow blink, that polite nod, that quiet decision to change the subject. So you stop trying. You keep it locked somewhere behind your ribs, underneath everything else, and you learn to carry it without letting it show. That's what I did for almost 3 years after I got out of Kathara Station. 3 years of normal. 3 years of pretending the only thing I'd done out there was run cargo routes and file tariff forms and argue with dock supervisors about weight manifests. 3 years of letting people think I was just another mid-tier freight operator who'd had a rough contract cycle and come home a little quieter than I left. Then my sister's kid, 14 years old, sharp as a blade, and completely fearless the way only teenagers can be, sat across from me at dinner one night and said, "Uncle Dren, why do you never talk about the Threshold War?" And something in me just cracked open. Not all at once, but enough. So I'm going to tell you what happened at Kathara Station. I'm going to tell you about Cell Block 9 and the V3 High Command, and the woman I shared a wall with for 62 days before they decided to put us in the same cage together. And I'm going to tell you about what happened when they did that. Because they made a mistake. The V3 made a lot of mistakes during that war, but that one, that specific, arrogant, completely avoidable mistake, cost them something they never got back. And it started with me and a woman named Sierra Vale. Let me back up. The year was 2387 by the old colonial calendar, though nobody used that anymore since the compact had switched to galactic standard. In GSC terms, it was the 3rd month of year 412. I was 31 years old. I had been running cargo routes in the Outer Rim for 6 years, mostly through the Kathara Corridor, a stretch of contested space that had been technically neutral since the armistice of 409, but practically speaking had never stopped being a war zone. You know those places, every system has them. The border zones where the rules exist on paper, but the reality on the ground is something completely different. Where you could be flying with all the right permits and all the right documentation and still have a V3 patrol vessel lock weapons on you because you happened to be in the wrong quadrant at the wrong time and they were in a bad mood. I'd been doing it long enough that I knew all the unofficial rules. You flew with your transponder running hot, never dim it, never ghost it, because that just made them nervous. You filed your route logs 3 days in advance with both the Compact Authority and the V3 Border Registry, so neither side could claim you were sneaking around. You kept your cargo bays accessible for inspection at any time. You flew slow, you flew obvious, and you never, under any circumstances, picked up passengers in the corridor without declaring them. I knew all of this. I followed all of it. And none of it mattered because the V3 stopped my ship, the Callowell's Reach, a Class IV mid-hauler that I'd been paying off for 4 years. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because they'd received intelligence that a compact courier vessel had gone dark somewhere in the corridor, and they were stopping everything in the vicinity. That's it, that's the whole reason. Someone else went dark and I was nearby, and the V3 didn't have time to be patient or precise, so they just swept everything up. They boarded my ship at gunpoint. They reviewed my documentation. They found nothing wrong. And then their commanding officer, a V3 called Veltharin, tall even by their standards, wearing the blue-gray armor of the 7th Interception Fleet, looked at me and said, in accented but perfectly functional standard, "You will accompany us to Kathara Station pending verification of your route authorization." I said I had already filed all my authorizations. He said verification would take time. I asked how long. He didn't answer. That was the moment I should have understood what was happening. But I was still thinking in legal terms. I was still thinking this was a bureaucratic problem with a bureaucratic solution. I was still thinking that if I was patient and cooperative and kept my hands visible and my mouth professional, someone would eventually run the numbers, confirm that I was exactly who I said I was, and let me go. I was 31 years old, and I still believed that systems, if you operated correctly within them, would treat you fairly. I learned something different at Kathara Station. The station itself was impressive in the way that things designed to intimidate are always impressive. It was a V3 military installation built into the side of an asteroid about 40 kilometers wide, the kind of rock that drifted through the outer corridor without any particular destination, which made it convenient for them. It was mobile enough to relocate if needed, but massive enough to anchor serious infrastructure. They'd been building on it for decades. You could see the generations in the architecture as they processed us in. The older sections were carved directly into the asteroid's iron-rich stone, low ceilings, rough walls, the kinds of corridors that felt like the inside of something that had been hollowed out rather than built. The newer sections were plated with the pale silver composite material that the V3 used in their modern military construction, all clean lines and precise angles, the kind of design that made you feel small without any single element being obviously threatening. They were very good at that, making you feel small. There were about 12 of us processed in that first sweep. 3 other cargo operators, 2 journalists who had been embedded with a compact observation team and gotten swept up by accident, 4 crew members from a mining survey ship, and 2 individuals whose business in the corridor I never fully understood. We were processed through decontamination, which was thorough enough to be slightly humiliating, the way all security procedures at that level are, and then separated. I didn't see most of the others again. I was taken deeper into the station than I expected. That should have told me something. Routine detention for verification purposes doesn't require the interior blocks. Those are for the long-term holds, the serious cases, the people they've already decided they have reasons to keep. They put me in cell block 9. The corridor was maybe 40 meters long, with cells on both sides, heavy doors, the kind with electromagnetic sealing rather than mechanical locks, which meant they couldn't be picked or forced without specialized equipment. Each cell was about 3 meters by 4, with a sleeping platform, a sanitation unit, and a light source that never fully turned off. The light was set at what I later figured out was V3 comfort level for artificial night, dim enough for them to consider it darkness, bright enough that humans found it difficult to sleep properly. Another small thing, another way of making you understand, without saying it directly, that this was their space, and you were a guest whose preferences didn't particularly matter. I spent the first 3 days doing what anyone does in a situation like that. I reviewed everything I remembered about the Compact's prisoner handling protocols. I tried to reconstruct the exact timeline of my route authorization filings so I could present them clearly when someone came to question me. I slept in fragments. I ate what they brought. The food was nutritionally adequate for humans, which told me they'd had human prisoners before and had calibrated for it, though it tasted like something that had been designed by a committee that had read about flavor as a concept, but never personally experienced it. I didn't hear much from the other cells. The electromagnetic doors were solid sound barriers. You could sometimes catch vibrations through the floor, footsteps, the distant thrum of the station's systems, occasional movement in the corridor, but actual voices were mostly gone. Mostly. On the 4th day, I heard something from the cell directly to my left. Not a voice exactly, more of a sound, rhythmic, low, like someone counting. I pressed my ear to the wall, which was that same pale composite material, cold enough to raise the hairs on my arm, and listened. Counting, definitely counting, but not in standard and not in any of the 3 or 4 trade pigeons I knew from corridor work. Something else. Something older sounding, if sound could have an age, with a cadence that felt almost like music even without melody. I knocked twice. The counting stopped. Silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then 2 knocks back. That was the beginning. We built a system over the next several days. It was slow work. Neither of us could hear the other's voice clearly, so we were limited to percussion. And developing a shared code from scratch through a wall when you can't speak to each other directly is the kind of puzzle that either drives you crazy or gives you something to hold on to. It gave me something to hold on to. She, I assumed from the voice fragments I eventually caught that it was a she, though I couldn't be certain, was patient with the process. More patient than me. When I made errors or got confused, she would repeat the pattern slowly, with the kind of deliberate clarity that told me she'd done something like this before. She understood how to communicate in difficult conditions. That was interesting. I didn't know what she was yet. I didn't know anything about her. I just knew she was in the cell next to mine, that she knocked back when I knocked, and that she counted in a language I didn't recognize when she thought no one was listening. On the 9th day, I got my first actual interaction with the V3 administration. A uniformed officer, younger than Veltherin, with the shorter crest markings that indicated a mid-rank administrative position, came to my cell with a documentation tablet and asked me a series of questions about my route history and my contacts within the Compact's Outer Rim office. I answered everything, fully, clearly, without evasion. I referenced my filed documentation repeatedly. I asked about my ship. They told me the Callowell's Reach was being held pending investigation. I asked how long investigation would take. They said it was ongoing. I asked if I could contact the Compact consular office. They said that request was noted. They left. I sat on the sleeping platform and understood, with the kind of clarity that comes when you've been trying very hard not to understand something, that this was not a verification hold. They weren't going to run the numbers and let me go. Something else was happening, something that had nothing to do with my route authorizations, and I was stuck inside it without being able to see what shape it was. That night, station night anyway, the cycle when the corridor lights dimmed further and the foot traffic dropped off, I heard the woman in the next cell singing. Softly, just barely audible through the composite wall. But unmistakable. It wasn't a war song or a defiant song or any of the things you might expect from someone in detention. It was something older. The kind of melody that sounds like it comes from a time before cities, a time when people sang because silence was dangerous and sound was how you remembered you were still alive. I pressed my palm flat against the wall and just listened. And something about it, the voice, the melody, the sheer, uncomplicated beauty of someone choosing to sing in a place like this, made me feel less alone in a way I hadn't expected. I fell asleep with my hand still on the wall. On the 17th day, they brought someone to question me who was different from the administrative officer. This one was older. No rank markings I could read, which in V3 terms sometimes meant high command and sometimes meant intelligence services, and neither possibility was comfortable. She V3 gender presentation was sometimes difficult for humans to read, but the deeper pitch of the translator's rendering suggested female, sat across from me in a small room off the main corridor, without a documentation tablet, without apparent notes, and looked at me with the kind of calm that is specifically designed to make you feel like she already knows everything and is just giving you the opportunity to be the one who tells it. She asked me about the compact courier vessel that had gone dark. I told her I didn't know anything about it. She asked about a specific compact intelligence operative, a name I didn't recognize. I told her I didn't know that name. She asked about my relationship with the Compact's Outer Rim Security Division. I told her I had no relationship with them, beyond the standard authorization filings that any cargo operator made. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You will be more comfortable if you choose to cooperate, Mr. Callowell." Callowell was my ship's name, not mine, and I pointed that out. My name is Dren Vashar. The ship was named for my grandfather. She noted that. Then she left. I was taken back to my cell, and I sat there for a long time thinking about the word comfortable and everything it implied. That night I knocked on the wall. 3 slow knocks are signal for I need to talk, or at least I need to hear that someone else is there. 2 slow knocks back, I'm here. 4 knocks, what's happening? She responded with a sequence we hadn't established yet. Something new. A pattern that repeated twice, which was her way of saying this is a word, learn it. I tapped back, say again, and she repeated it. Then she added 2 more patterns I did know, later, and I explain. I tapped back, okay. And somehow, even through a wall, even in a language we'd built from scratch with our knuckles, that felt like a conversation. Like an actual human conversation, which sounds like a strange thing to say about the person on the other side of the wall, given what I found out later. But I didn't know what she was yet. And by the time I found out, it didn't change very much. Day 23 was the first time they changed the dynamic in a way that scared me. 3 guards, not the usual administrative staff. These ones were in the heavier armor, the operational gear, came to my cell and told me I was being moved. I asked where. They didn't answer. Movement in a place like Cathara Station is never a neutral thing. Routine administrative movement happens on a schedule, with documentation, with a reason they're usually willing to name even if it's vague. Guards in operational gear with no stated destination means something happened, or someone decided something, and you're on the receiving end of it. They took me out of the cell block and through a series of corridors that went deeper into the asteroid lower pressure zones. I could feel it in my ears, into a section of the station I hadn't seen before. This part was older. The carved stone construction, the low ceilings, the feeling of weight overhead. They put me in a room with no sleeping platform and no sanitation unit, and told me to wait. I waited for what I estimated was 4 hours, though without any time reference it could have been more. Then they brought someone else in. She was tall, not tall the way the V3 were tall. They had that elongated quality, that architectural height, but tall for a human, or what I initially processed as near human. She moved differently from how humans usually move in close spaces. There was no hesitation at the doorway, no instinctive assessment of the room before entering, just a smooth, continuous motion like she'd already mapped it from the outside. She had dark hair, cut close on one side and loose on the other in a way that seemed less stylistic and more like it had grown out unevenly, and she'd simply decided to work with it rather than fight it. Her skin was very pale, not the pallor of someone unwell, but a deeper paleness, the kind that looked like it had never been anything else. Her eyes, when she looked at me, were dark in the center and lighter at the edges, which was unusual, though in the low lighting I couldn't be certain I was seeing clearly. She looked at me. I looked at her. She said, in standard that was accented but precise, "You are in cell 9 left." I said yes. She said, "I am in cell 9 right." And the recognition hit me, the person in the next cell, the counter, the singer, the one who'd knocked back twice on the 4th day, was standing in front of me. I said, "You're the one who was counting." Her expression changed in a very small way, not quite a smile, something more cautious than that. "You heard that. Through the wall, your voice carries." She considered this. "I will count more quietly." I didn't say it bothered me. I looked around the room. "Do you know why they moved us?" "Yes," she said, simply, like she'd had access to information I hadn't. "They are testing something." "Testing what?" She looked at me again with those dark-centered eyes. "Me, they are testing whether I will feed." I heard that sentence. I processed it. And then I said very calmly, because I had spent 23 days training myself to stay calm in this place, "Feed on what?" She held my gaze without looking away. "You." The silence in that room lasted a long time. I want to be honest about this part because I think the honest version is more interesting than the version where I'm immediately composed and rational about it. The honest version is that my first instinct was to back against the wall, which I did. My second instinct was to look for anything in the room I could use. There was nothing. They designed it that way. My third instinct was to keep her talking, because people who are talking to you are not simultaneously doing other things to you, and this principle applies broadly. So I said, "You're V3." And she said, "No, I am V3." The distinction in the sentence was subtle but deliberate, and I took a moment to figure it out. She wasn't V3, the species that ran this station, the soldier-caste galactic power that had been fighting the Compact for 11 years. She was V3 in a different sense, a descriptor rather than a species name. I said, "Explain that to me." She tilted her head slightly, like she was deciding how much to say. The word V3 means, in the old tongue, approximately, those who take from the living. The species took the name later. They thought it was a compliment. "And you?" "I am what the word described before they claimed it." She paused. "Your people would call me a vampire. The word is old and somewhat inaccurate, but it is the one most humans know." I stared at her. She stared back. I said, "So when you said feed?" "I am very old," she said. "I have been in this cell for a long time, longer than you. The V3, the species, know what I am. They took me because they believed I could be used, as a weapon or as a tool or as a test subject. They have been trying to understand my biology for months." A pause. "I have not been cooperative." "They're starving you." "They are attempting to. They have miscalculated the timeline. And putting me in this room with you is. They believe hunger will eventually override reason. They are watching to see if I will simply take from you rather than choose to." I let that sit for a moment, then I said, "Will you?" She looked at me, directly, with the kind of directness that I think only becomes possible when you are genuinely very old, when you have been in enough rooms with enough kinds of people that you have stopped performing reassurance, because you know it doesn't actually help. "No," she said, "not without consent, never without consent. That is not a rule they gave me. It is something I decided myself a very long time ago." I believed her. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because liars usually offer more. They give you more reasoning, more reassurance, more texture around the thing they want you to accept. She gave me almost nothing. Just the fact, stated plainly, and then she waited. "Okay," I said. "Okay," she said. And we sat down on opposite sides of that room, and we started to talk. Her name was Sierra Vale. She told me that herself on day 24, after they'd moved us into a shared cell, a different one from either of our original cells, slightly larger, designed clearly as an observation space. The ceiling had sensor clusters spaced every meter and a half. She pointed them out to me within the first 10 minutes, naming their functions: visual recording, biosign monitoring, atmospheric sampling, and one in the far corner that she thought might be something she didn't recognize. "You know their technology," I said. "I have been watching them for longer than their species has had space travel," she said. It wasn't boastful, just factual. She sat on the sleeping platform. There was one, a concession to my human requirements she'd clearly already calculated, with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, and she looked around the room the way I'd started to recognize. Constantly, methodically, not anxious but cataloging. I sat on the floor across from her. "Why did they take you?" I asked. "A compact research team found something," she said. "A location I had used for a very long time, a private place deep in a dead system in the outer corridor. They recorded it before I could obscure the records. The V3 intercepted those records." She paused. "The location contained artifacts, items that are very old. The V3 want to know what they are, where they came from, and whether they can be weaponized." "Can they?" "Some of them, yes." Her voice didn't change. "I will not tell them that." "And the others?" "The others are just," she stopped, looked at a point on the floor. "They are just things I kept from people I knew a long time ago." There was something in the word people that carried weight, the specific weight of specificity. Like she meant specific people, not people in general. I said, "How old are you?" She looked at me with something that was almost amusement. That is always the question humans ask first. What do other species ask first? "What I want, what I eat, whether I can be killed." A pause. The V3 asked the last one immediately, within the first hour. "Can you be?" "Yes," simply. "Fewer methods than your legends suggest, but yes." I asked again, "How old?" She was quiet for a moment. "I do not count by years anymore. It stopped being useful around the time the calendar changed for the third time in the region I was living in." She thought about it. "I was alive when what is now the Compact was 3 separate civilizations that had not yet encountered each other. I watched them make first contact." A pause. "I watched the second contact and the third. I watched the wars. I watched what came after the wars." I didn't say anything. "Very old," she said. "That is the honest answer, very old and still here." The V3 came on day 26 to question her in my presence. I think they expected that my presence would make her more compliant somehow, either through concern for me, or because they thought she'd have been weakened by hunger and might slip in front of an audience. They sent the older officer, the one without rank markings, the one who'd questioned me about the courier vessel. She brought 2 guards. Sierra sat through the entire thing, without changing her posture by a centimeter. The questions were what I expected from what she'd told me. The artifacts, the location, the history of the site, whether anyone else knew about it. The officer's questions were careful and intelligent, which told me she'd been briefed thoroughly. Sierra answered nothing, not defiantly, not silently. She would look at whoever was speaking and simply wait with a patience that was not passive. It was active, pointed, the kind of waiting that communicated very clearly that she had considered the question and declined to engage with it. At one point, the officer turned to me and said, "Has she told you anything about the artifacts?" I said no. "You have been observed in conversation." "We talk. She hasn't told me about the artifacts." "What have you discussed?" I looked at the officer. I looked at the sensor clusters in the ceiling, which they were obviously monitoring, because why wouldn't they be? I said, she told me she used to know 3 separate civilizations before they knew each other existed. I told her about my grandfather who built things with his hands. We talked about the difference between a ship that's paid off and a ship that's yours. I paused. We've been in a cell together for 3 days, people talk. The officer looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Sierra. Sierra looked back at her with that same active, pointed calm. They left. When they were gone, Sierra was quiet for a while. Then she said, your grandfather built things. He was a fabricator. Structural materials mostly for colonial builds in the mid-rim. I leaned back against the wall. He built the chassis for the Callowell's Reach. That's why I named the ship for him. That is a significant reason to name something. He died before I could fly it, so, I shrugged. It felt right. She said nothing for a moment. Then, the artifacts in that location, some of them were left by people I knew, people who built things, who were very careful with what they made because they understood that what you make outlasts you. She paused. One of them was a navigator, in a time before your space travel, when navigation meant reading the sky with your eyes and your memory and nothing else. She could find her way anywhere. She taught me how to read the stars before anyone had named them. I didn't ask anything, I just listened. Her name was Ayla, she said. She died 4,000 years ago by a calendar that no longer exists, but I still remember the way she described the southern stars in the old sky. She said they looked like someone had spilled salt on dark cloth. We sat with that for a while. I said, that's why you keep the artifacts. Yes. They know you'll never tell them. They suspect, they are not yet certain. People in their situation prefer to believe they haven't yet found the right pressure. She looked at the ceiling sensors. They will look for pressure points. She was looking at me when she said it. And I understood what she meant. I had become a potential pressure point. That's why they'd put us together. Not just to starve her into feeding, that was one test. The other test was whether having someone to protect would change her calculus. I said, I won't be a leverage point if you don't let it work. She looked at me. I mean it, I said. Don't change what you do because of me. Don't tell them anything because of me. I paused. I'm not worth your navigator's stars. Another long silence. I have not decided, she said finally, that you are not worth protecting. You were in cell 9 left for 23 days, she said very precisely. You knocked on the 4th day. You waited for me to knock back before you did it again. You did not assume I would respond. You gave me the choice. She paused. That is not a small thing. I didn't know what to say to that. In addition, she said, with something that was almost dry, you are the first person in 8 months who has asked me about myself before asking what I can do for them. The V3 researchers, the intelligence officers, the 2 compact operatives they brought through before you, all of them wanted capability assessments first. You asked my name. I said it seemed like the right order. It is the right order, she said. Most people forget that. Day 31 was when things started to change in a way that neither of us had expected. It started with the guard rotation. I'd been tracking it, something to do, something to focus on, and the rotation had been consistent for the entire time I'd been in the combined cell. 6-hour cycles, 3 guards minimum in the corridor at any time with a supervisor check in every 18 hours. Regular, predictable. The kind of schedule that said the command structure was stable and in control. On day 31, the rotation broke. I noticed it because the check-in was late. Then the rotation shift happened 37 minutes early. Then 2 guards that I'd seen consistently over the past week didn't appear at all, replaced by unfamiliar faces, guards who moved with more tension in their shoulders, who checked their communications devices too often. I told Sierra. She already knew. She'd been tracking it too by sound. Her hearing was considerably more precise than mine. She'd mentioned it without elaborating, and I'd taken her at her word. Something has happened, she said, outside the station. Can you tell what? No, but the communication traffic has increased. I can hear the carrier frequency of their command channel, not the content, but the volume and frequency of transmissions. It has increased by a significant factor in the last 6 hours. Compact engagement. Possibly, or V3 command directing resources away from this region. She paused. Either way, this station is not currently their priority. That is potentially relevant. I looked at the sensor clusters in the ceiling. They're still watching us, I said. Yes, but with fewer people watching the watchers. She was quiet for a moment. I have been evaluating the electromagnetic ceiling on the door. I looked at her. It is sophisticated, she said, but it has a specific vulnerability that exists in this model of door system. The V3 adopted this ceiling type approximately 2 decades ago from a captured compact installation. It was designed for compact security parameters, which did not account for certain biological capabilities. Certain being yours. Yes, she paused. I have been waiting to see if circumstances would create an appropriate window. I believe they are beginning to. You can open the door. I can disrupt the sealing mechanism sufficiently that a secondary manual engagement would complete the process. I cannot do both parts. I would need you to do the second part. I looked at the door. The electromagnetic seal had a physical override panel on the inside, required by some kind of universal prisoner safety standard, which was grimly ironic given the context. The panel was accessible. The question was what happened after. 40 meters of corridor, I said. Guards at both ends and in between. Yes. And then whatever's between the cell block and a docking bay. Yes. My ship is still in their dock somewhere. I know where, she said. I have listened to enough of their logistics communications to have constructed a reasonable map of the docking configuration. Your ship is in secondary bay 14. It has not been moved. I stared at her. You've been building a map. For 4 months, she said calmly. One listens to things in here. I sat back, thought about it. Thought about the changed guard rotation, the increased comms traffic, the possibility that somewhere outside this asteroid a battle was happening that was pulling V3 attention away from a mid-rim human cargo operator and a very old woman they'd locked up for her artifacts. I said, if we try this and it doesn't work. The consequences will be severe, she said. Yes. And if we don't try, they will eventually find the pressure that changes my position. She looked at me directly. I have held against worse than this. But I am hungry in a way that is beginning to affect my concentration, and concentration is the primary thing I am relying on to maintain my position. The window will not improve. I looked at the ceiling sensors, at the door at her. The hunger, I said. Is there anything we can do about that before we try this? She went very still. I said, I'm not saying I understand what I'm offering or exactly what it involves. I'm saying that if it makes the difference between you being able to think clearly when we need it and not, and if you're willing to tell me honestly what it actually means and what the actual risk is, then I want to hear it. Dren. What? Why? I thought about it, because you told me about Ayla and the Sultan Darkcloth stars. Because you knocked back when I knocked. Because you've been building a map for 4 months and you waited for the right window instead of just using me as soon as they put me in here. Because I like you and I want to get us both out of this place. I paused. Those are the reasons. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said very carefully, it is not painful. There are compounds in what I do that prevent pain. It would leave a mark but nothing permanent. The amount I would require to restore functional concentration is small, less than a blood donation at any modern medical facility. She paused. I have never taken from anyone without consent and I have never taken more than was safe. I would like to continue that record. Okay, I said. You understand what you're agreeing to. I understand more than you might expect, given that I've apparently been sharing a cell with you for 8 days and a wall before that. I held out my arm. Tell me what you need me to do. She looked at my arm, then at me, then back at my arm. What she did then was brief and precise, and she was right, it wasn't painful. There was a brief pressure, and then a warmth that spread up my arm faster than I expected, and then a strange floating quality to my thoughts for about 90 seconds, which she'd warned me about. Then she sat back. The change in her was not dramatic, nothing Hollywood about it, nothing like the old Earth stories. She didn't transform or crackle with energy. She just became slightly more present. Like something that had been slightly dimmed turned back up to its proper brightness. Her eyes cleared. Her posture shifted just a fraction. She said, thank you. Don't thank me, I said. Just get us out of here. The attempt started 3 days later. I want to be clear about something. It was not elegant. None of it was elegant. The stories about dramatic escapes tend to clean things up in retrospect, smooth out the moments where everything nearly went wrong, replace the physical fear with cinematic confidence. I'm not going to do that because the real version is more interesting. The first part, Sierra disrupting the seal, took longer than either of us had expected. What she could do with electromagnetic fields was something I still don't have a complete scientific vocabulary for. She'd explained it in broad terms. She was not psychic. She was not magical. She had a biological capacity for generating precise bioelectric interference that was a real, physical phenomenon that human science had not yet fully characterized. And the V3 science hadn't characterized it either, which was part of why she was here. She stood at the door for approximately 7 minutes very still, with her hands almost but not quite touching the frame, and I watched the status light on the seal panel flicker. Twice it went from green to amber and then snapped back to green. The third time it went to amber and stayed there. She stepped back, nodded at me. I hit the manual override. The door swung open. 40 meters of corridor, 2 guards visible at the far end, one at the near end who heard the door and turned around. Here is the thing about spending 62 days in a cell. You have time to think about what you would do in every scenario. You run the numbers. You go through the contingencies. It isn't training. I had no military training, no combat experience, nothing like that. But the human brain, given enough boredom and enough fear, becomes very focused on survival scenarios. I'd thought about this corridor a lot. I ran, not toward the guard, but to the side, to the recessed doorway of the cell directly across from ours, which created enough of an angle that the guard's initial shot. They were using electrostatic stun rounds. I found out later, which was notable because it meant they'd had orders to take us alive, hit the wall instead of me. Sierra moved differently. I'd seen how she moved in the cell. I knew she was fast in the way that is difficult to fully process when you're looking at it directly, where your brain tells you that the physics of it require more time than it appeared to take. But in a 40-meter corridor, it was different. In a confined space with a clear line of movement, it was something I don't have precise language for. The near guard was neutralized, not killed. She was very specific about this afterward, before the sound of his stun round had finished echoing. The 2 far guards had time to react, but their reactions were built around the assumption that the threat was moving at a speed their training had prepared them for. It wasn't. What happened in that corridor took less time than I've spent describing it. Then we were moving. Her map was correct. I want to say that with appropriate emphasis. She had built, from sound and inference and 4 months of careful listening, a map of the interior of a military asteroid installation that was accurate enough to navigate by in near darkness with guards mobilizing behind us. Secondary Bay 14 was 3 levels down and through 2 sections that required her to interface with door systems the same way she'd done with our cell. Both times it worked. Both times it took longer than I wanted. We could hear the alarm by the time we were in the docking bay. The Callowell's reach was exactly where she said it would be. It was in docking clamps, which was the obvious problem. You can't just fly out of magnetic docking clamps. You need either the release code or a physical disconnection, and both of those options required time I wasn't sure we had. Sierra said, I can do the clamps. I need 3 minutes. I said, I'll get the ship ready. The access codes to my own ship were not something they'd changed. Either they hadn't gotten around to it, or they'd assumed it didn't matter since I was in a cell. Either way, the ship opened for me, and I had never been as grateful for anything in my life as I was for the familiar sound of the Callowell's reach cycling up. I ran the emergency startup sequence. Bypassed the usual checks. She needed pre-launch atmosphere, navigation, propulsion, shields in that order. Everything else could wait. My hands were doing things I'd done 10,000 times before, and the muscle memory was so deeply grooved that my mind had room to be terrified while my hands remained completely professional, which was a strange sensation. The docking bay alert was at its highest when I heard the clamp release, all 4 of them in sequence, which meant she'd done it faster than 3 minutes. She was in the ship 20 seconds later. I said, strap in. She said, the bay door. I know. The bay door was closed. Standard security response. You couldn't just fly a ship through a closed bay door. What you could do with a ship that had been built by a man who believed in over-engineering critical systems was target the door's hydraulic actuators, the specific structural points where the panels articulated, with your docking thrusters at emergency reverse, which would not blow the door open but would certainly compromise its ability to remain properly closed. My grandfather had built those thrusters slightly oversized for the chassis class. He'd told me once that a machine should always have more than it needed, because you never knew what the need would turn out to be. I thought of him as I fired them. The bay door buckled. Not open, not completely, but enough. I pushed the ship through a gap that was a quarter-meter narrower than the ship's profile, and I will never know exactly how we fit, and I have chosen to attribute it to the Callowell's reach being the ship my grandfather built, and therefore capable of things that the spec sheets don't account for. We were outside. Asteroid surface on two sides, open space ahead, the V3 station's exterior gun emplacements beginning to track behind us. I hit the drive. The pursuit lasted 4 hours. I won't detail all of it because honestly some of it was just waiting and hoping and calculating jump windows, which is not cinematic so much as it is the specific, numbing terror of watching a countdown and a radar screen at the same time. What I will tell you is that the V3 pursuit ships were faster than the Callowell's reach in a straight line. They always are military versus commercial, no contest. What the Callowell's reach had was a jump drive that my grandfather had also built slightly oversized, which meant it could spool faster than its class rating and jump with a narrower safety margin than military vessels were typically willing to risk. I was willing to risk it. Sierra sat in the co-pilot seat. She'd figured out the basic interface within the first hour, which I should not have found surprising, and managed the shield distribution while I flew, which freed my hands for the navigation and drive controls. We didn't talk much during those 4 hours. There wasn't room for talking. But at one point, when the pursuit ships had gotten close enough that I could see their running lights clearly on the rear cameras, she reached across and adjusted a shield setting I hadn't gotten to yet, and the shot that would have hit our starboard drive assembly hit the shield instead. I said, "Thank you." She said, "We are even." I laughed. It surprised me, the laugh coming out at that particular moment, but there it was. We jumped when the window opened. The first jump took us to the edge of the Cathara corridor, far enough from the station that the pursuit ships would need to recalculate and revector. The second jump took us into compact space proper, where V3 pursuit was a political problem rather than a tactical one. I dropped out of the second jump and just sat there for a moment. The alarms were quiet. The drives were at cruise. The Callowell's reach was making the specific low sound she made when everything was running normally, like a hum under all the other sounds, like breathing. I put my forehead on the console. Sierra said, "You should breathe." I said, "I am breathing." "More," she said, "and slower." I laughed again, less surprising this time. We stayed in that part of compact space for 2 days while I filed the incident reports, contacted the compact consular office, documented everything I could remember about Cathara Station's layout, and argued with approximately 6 different administrative levels about what my legal status was given that I'd been detained without due process and had technically escaped a military installation. Sierra stayed in the ship for most of this. She was not, she explained, in a position to identify herself to compact authorities in the current political climate. I understood that. We had a lot of conversations in those 2 days. Long ones, unhurried ones, the kind of conversations you can have when the immediate emergency is behind you and you're both slightly in shock, and there's nothing to do but wait for bureaucrats to return communication requests. She told me about other places she'd been. Not all of them, not by a long distance, but some of them. She told me about a city that no longer existed, in a region that was now the floor of an inland sea on a world that had been terraformed 3 centuries ago. She told me about a market she'd traded in, 500 years back, where they sold star charts drawn on material that she said was not quite what I'd think of as paper. She told me about a war she'd watched from above, literally above, from the high ground of a mountain range, because she'd been curious about the tactics, and it had seemed safer to observe. I told her about 6 years of cargo routes and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being perpetually in transit, always moving, never anywhere long enough to put down roots, building a life made entirely of waypoints. I told her about my sister's family, the only fixed point I had. I told her about my grandfather and his oversized thrusters and his belief that a machine should always have more than it needed. She said he understood something important. I said he never left the midrim. He built things for other people to take to places he'd never been. That is also a way of going, she said. The things he built he went through them. I thought about the bay door, the gap a quarter meter too narrow, the ship that had fit anyway. Yeah, I said, I think you're right. On the second day in the late station night cycle, when the light through the ship's small viewport was just the cold, permanent stars of this quadrant, I said, what are you going to do now? She was quiet for a moment. There are other artifacts I have kept in places they have not found. I will need to move them. A pause. I had planned to do this alone. But I find that I am not entirely opposed to assistance. She looked at me with those dark-centered eyes. You have a ship that can jump faster than its class rating. And a grandfather who built it oversized. Yes, a pause. And you are, so far, the only person in a very long time who asked my name before asking my capabilities. I looked out the viewport at the stars. I'll need to know where we're going, I said. I will tell you, she said, when we are moving. You still don't entirely trust me. I trust you more than I have trusted anyone in several decades, she said. I am simply cautious. Old habits. Old habits, I agreed. You should sleep, she said. You have been awake for longer than is healthy. What about you? I do not sleep in the same way. I will watch the instruments. I leaned back in the pilot's seat. The Callowell's reach hummed. The stars were fixed and permanent and indifferent, and somehow, in that moment, completely fine. I said, Sierra, yes, I'm glad you knocked back. A pause, I am glad you knocked first. I slept. I want to tell you one last thing before I finish this part of the story. When the Compact eventually completed their investigation into the Cathara Station incident, 2 years later, by which point I had filed enough documentation and given enough testimony and submitted enough evidence that the whole picture was more or less on the record, their assessment included a section on what the V3 had lost. Not in military terms, not in asset terms. In intelligence terms. Because the records they'd held about Sierra Vale's location, the original research team's recordings, the V3's own 4 months of documentation and analysis, all of that had been on servers that, it turned out, had been compromised during the incident by a very specific and very elegant piece of electronic interference that the V3's technical team could not trace to any known source. It wasn't me. I had enough to do flying the ship. When I asked Sierra about it, she said, I told you the electromagnetic capacity was biological. I did not say it was limited to proximity. I stared at her. She looked at me with those dark-centered eyes and said nothing else. The V3 lost 4 months of data on what she was, what she could do, and where she'd come from. They lost the location of the artifacts. They lost whatever leverage they'd thought they were building. They'd put us in that room together, expecting to break one of us. They'd gotten us out of there instead. My nephew at the dinner table, 14 years old and fearless, had asked me about the Threshold War. I told him that specific story. When I was done, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, Is she still out there? I thought about it. Yes, I said. Do you still talk to her? I thought about the message that had come through my ship's secondary channel 3 weeks ago. 12 words, a set of coordinates and a time window, nothing else. Because we'd spent 62 days learning to communicate in minimal signals and old habits die hard. Sometimes, I said. He said, Were you scared in the cell? Every day, I said, but she knocked back, and it's easier to be scared when you're not alone. He thought about that. That's a good reason, he said. It's the only one, I said. That's usually enough. Outside, the stars were doing what they always did, burning at distances that made the word distance mean something different than it normally did, cold and permanent and indifferent. Somewhere in the outer corridor, a very old woman was moving artifacts from a hiding place they'd found to one they hadn't. And somewhere in docking bay 12 of the compact way station, where I'd put down for the week, A Class IV mid-hauler named for a man who'd built things slightly bigger than they needed to be was sitting in her clamps, fueled and ready, waiting for coordinates. She always had more than she needed. That was the point. That was always the point.